from Monday morning, which is later than our normal recording time because we had a little surprise in our beehives this week. I will bring you the frame that will show you the gigantic bear prints, but we in fact had a visit from Ursa americanus, and that has set me back a little bit because it required installation of a bear fence. So we were talking about plants the last time we met together. So this is a review session that is just going to show you what a good example of notes should look like. Make sure you have at least this amount of information in your notes. If you don't, then go ahead and recopy or add to your notes. If you have more information, that's great. That means your note taking is coming along well. So we introduced the plants with a little review of classification. So we talked about biological classification. Remember, up to this point, we studied one phylum, and that was Arthropoda, okay? And when we were exploring the arthropods, we actually went through a couple of different classes. So we did insects, we did crustaceans, we did the millipedes, the centipedes, all of those. And with the insects, we specifically went through lots of different orders. So if you guys remember, there were 8 different orders. Hymenoptera were one of them. And we talked a lot about things on the level of the order, okay? With our plants, we're actually going to be talking more about phylums. So you can see the classification scheme is the same for animals as it is for plants. Now, I'm going to attach to the end of our email here the Brain Pop videos on classification again. I also will reattach the ones on photosynthesis and plants. And finally, there's one that is going to be on cells because I know not all of you have had cells. So do go back and look at the classification again. It's more just a biological concept than a concept that's specific to flora and fauna, but it is one that I want you to have. I want you to know domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So one of the ways you can remember that is, did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? So that's an acrostic, and that's kind of a fun way to remember it. But we're going to see the same thing. We're going to see, did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? Now, you don't see domain here because the domain classification scheme is relatively new. I actually was not taught that. But that is a way to remember classification schemes. So in your notes, you would just write classification. Did King Philip come over for good spaghetti? Same domain. Okay, so plants are still in the eukarya, but it's a new kingdom. It's kingdom Plantae. So here's an example of Acer saccharum, and I asked you guys in class what you thought that was, and actually it was London who told us that in fact that was a sugar maple. They do maple syruping, so I'm going to have her talk a little bit about that when the time comes in February when we talk about what happens when in nature. But we are moving into Plantae, okay? So you're going to hear different Latin and Greek names. Remember, these are man-made groupings of God-made life. So in this case, it was domain Eukarya, kingdom Plantae, phylum Magnoliophyta, class Magnoliosida, order Sapindales, family Acaceracea, genus Acer, species Saccharum. So that's just a big bunch of words that we have used to classify God's creation. Does not mean that these things evolved or are necessarily related to a common ancestor. Okay, so don't get fooled. I don't think any of you will. So we had a little scripture reading from Genesis 1:29. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And God knew just what he was doing with plants. If you eat the things that he created for you and for your body, you will be a very healthy person. So all of these great things here that grow in New England, here is their little chart of what grows when by season. If you can concentrate on making most of what you eat, these things, it will do your body good. So that is how we started class. Then we moved on to cells. Now, not everybody has been introduced to the concept of cells. So we are made of cells. God used cells to construct his multicellular creations. He did make some creatures just with one cell. This is a plant cell. Okay, so in my notes, what I've done is I left room when I was in class. Actually, I was teaching, but I told you guys, I said, leave some room. And then I went back and copied the scripture. Okay. So you might find when you're in class, as you go back and you fill in the notes later, that's a good skill to have. I gave you each a plant cell and I said, color that. So you can see I colored my plant cell with colored pencils and I circled the color of the thing that I used. So these are all the parts of a plant cell. So if you haven't had cells, the Brain Pop video attached to this email will tell you more about what does what in a cell. Basically, your mitochondrion are your little power plants. The vacuole is unique to plants. So the vacuole in the cell wall and the chloroplast, those are the things that are unique to plant cells. Okay, the vacuole is what creates turgor pressure. We talked about what happens if you let celery sit out. I had that really floppy piece of celery. This vacuole gets exhausted. Its water supply goes down. So now there's no pressure on these walls and the thing just turns into a shrinking violet. You've heard of that expression, right? The chloroplast is the power plant that actually creates the power. It's the catcher. Plants eat light, okay? And they do that because God made these amazing things called chloroplasts. When you learn the biochemistry of the thylakoid membrane, if you go to that level of science in college, it will rock your world. But it's really, really cool. The Golgi apparatus and the endoplasmic say that 3 times fast. Endoplasmic reticulum are related organelles, so they're actually related to each other. And again, when you get to biology, you'll learn more of that. But I elected to color them the same color. The nucleus is sort of the brain of the cell, and plants also have the plasmodesmata. That is also a unique thing. Some other organisms have this. Fungi have this too, and there are actually some tissues that have this. But basically, they're little holes that allows water and nutrients to flow back and forth. So this is a really, really schematic, abstract diagram of what a plant cell looks like. It's easy for you to see. Everything that's here is here, except maybe the amyloplast. That's just a little granule that stores starch. Sometimes like potato plants will have a lot of those, okay? Centrosome helps it divide. But basically, that is what a plant cell is. Now, remember, we did look under the microscope at plant cells. So this is something that I want to show you because you're going to see it again. Okay. And I thought it was kind of a nice little lesson in biology that we get while we're on the subject of plants. So then we talked about chlorophyll. Okay, so now I've gone to page 2, class notes. My date is on here. I ran out of graph paper, so I'm using lined paper today, but you guys are going to be, these notes are going to be in your science notebook, okay? I wrote chlorophyll, divine design. So what did I write in my notes? It's a big molecule that catches light and turns it into energy, and it's found in chloroplast. So here's the big molecule. Okay, this is the porphyrin ring part. Now, hemoglobin also has a porphyrin ring. This is something that, God's going to use the same stuff again and again and again and again. So he's pretty amazing in what he does. And people will say, oh, clearly these structures are conserved. Therefore, they must have come from a common ancestor. No, God isn't going to reinvent the wheel every time he makes something new. He's a genius. He's incredible, right? So he's going to take a design that works and he's going to use it again and again. And this is, I'm showing you this giant complicated looking thing so that you can see, this is amazing. We as humans haven't ever made anything this small that does this much work. So this molecule catches light, and inside of the chloroplast there is something called a granum, which is a stack of these thylakoid membranes. And the thylakoid membranes are where this reaction happens. There's a whole bunch of them like this because it creates a whole bunch of surface area, so the reaction can occur in lots of places. So then we went on and talked about endosymbiosis. And the reason I did is that your Brain Pop video on photosynthesis in plants starts with this theory, and they're serious about it. They're like, yeah, the plants came from algae. I'm not sure exactly how God did all of it and at what times he did it, but I know he did it. And these things are pretty different. The cyanobacteria is a prokaryotic organism that does do photosynthesis. So it does have chlorophyll, but it looks different than the chloroplast. There are thylakoids. So there's definitely some things that are in common, but this whole idea that Chloroplasts are the result of a cyanobacterium that entered a cell millions and millions of years ago, and that resulted in the evolution of plants from algae. I'm not sure I buy that at all. And, the reason is that, first of all, these things aren't exactly alike. So if this thing went into a cell and it worked, why would it change, right? No, he created this because he needed a different variation on this design. And then the other thing is, okay, let's just pretend this really happened. Okay, let's pretend this really is true, right? Okay, that's great and all, but where did this thing come from? Who made this, right? Because this is a little tiny nanobiotechnological device of grabbing energy from light. I mean, we can't even make solar panels on houses that do very much, right? We haven't figured out how to harness the sun and grow. So, it's one of these things where when we're presented with faulty logic or, the scientific consensus, I'm always going to rebut that for you guys. So this is my rebuttal to you. When you see, plants came from algae, my question is, really? Explain how, explain why, because I'm not seeing a logical explanation. Okay, I see things in common. Okay, God uses things over and over, right? He uses chitin in mushrooms and in insects and arthropods, right? We talked about that's the structure of the cell wall of the fungal organisms and of the hard exoskeleton of these creatures that we just got through studying. He uses chlorophyll in both the blue-green algae or cyanobacteria, regular green algae, and plants. Okay, so here's my notes. Here's what my notes look like. Okay, so you may not have exactly notes like this, but you're going to want to have some comments. You definitely want to have it because you might see it on a test. Okay, hate to say it, but you might see it on a test. So I don't want it to be foreign to you. But basically, who made the chloroplast? It's very sophisticated. And then here's my rebuttal. Now you'll see I'm really using my 4-color pen here. I'm doing that more and more for you guys so that you can see how helpful it is to use different colors when you're organizing notes and thoughts. Okay, so do that if you can. All right, so that was the endosymbiosis and the rebuttal of brain pop. God uses the same design over and over. We're going to keep seeing this. Here's a picture of a single cell of algae. Here is an apical meristem. So this is the portion of a plant that's going to grow. And you can see there's chlorophyll in both of these. So that's, what they have in common. But they're pretty different living organisms and very, very different, very exquisite differences in their design. So we moved to plants and we said, okay, here we go into the world of plants, diving in with 4 phyla. Now remember, with arthropods, it was kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropoda. And I think I might have said chordata. And that's because being a veterinarian, I'm so fixated on mammals. And that was actually not right. The phylum is Arthropoda. We will get to chordata. Arthropods do have central nervous systems, but they are in ganglion form. They're not an actual true brain. So more on that to come. So we went through these 4 phyla, 1, 2, 3, 4. So remember, with the arthropods, we were looking at different classes and orders. Now we're looking at different phylums. So this is a different part of the classification scheme that we're on. But it's the same idea. I mean, God said, name these things. I'm going to give you all these, name them all and use them. And he gave them to us for food. So in fact, that's what we did. So we started with the mosses. So I took my sheet here, I glued it into my notebook, and I knew I was going to talk about 4 phylums. So I went back after the 4 phylums and I labeled 1, 2, 3, 4 to keep them straight. Okay, so you guys will probably want to do that too. So phylum number 1 was mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Those used to all be known together as bryophytes. Now we have things like superphylums and subphylums and all kinds of things as we've started to classify things. If you see a bryophyte written down somewhere, that's what this is. So what are bryophytes, or mosses, liverworts, and hornworts? They are a phylum of plantae with no flowers, no vessels, and spores to reproduce. So what does that mean? Well, remember William's funny paper towel demonstration, right? I gave him a cup with a paper towel and I gave him a cup with a straw. And I said, okay, drink water using the paper towel, then drink water using the straw. Well, what works better? Well, obviously you're going to be able to drink up all that water with a straw. And if that water is what you need to grow, you're going to be able to grow big and strong if you can get a lot of it, right? Well, these guys can't do that. They don't have any vessels, so they're naturally very small, okay? I gave you a very complicated picture of the life cycle, All right. Just remember that all you need to know about from that is that these guys reproduce with spores. So here's the complicated life cycle picture, right? Did all of this? Don't worry about all of that. You'll get all of that in high school biology. But here's your little spores right here. Tiny. There's one. There's another. There's a whole bunch of them. Here's an electron micrograph of a peristome that ruptures open, and those are at the top of these. See this right here? That's where all the spores are, right in there. Okay. So I gave you some examples. This is a soft hair cat moss. All right. And again, you don't have to remember these. These are flora of New England, but I'm not going to have you remember all 352 mosses. Just know that they have no vessels. Know that they have no flowers. They grow in wet, moist areas low to the ground. They do not get very big. This is a brocade moss. Okay. They're really beautiful, actually. They're really cool. And here's more bryophyte fun. So here's an example of a liverwort. Okay, if you went to the Tower Hill Botanical Garden tour, we saw these on the fountain. She pointed them out. These grow on banks of streams. And this is a hornwort, which in this case, it's an aquatic plant. Okay, so same thing. These look a little bit bigger, but they still do not have any blood vessels. They don't make flowers, and they reproduce by spores. So that's it. That's all you have to know about the mosses. Okay, pretty neat though. See, there's that little spore capsule. Neat. So that's phylum 1. Okay. Now we talked about phylum 2. So I said, get out your field guide, because now we're going to start doing some examples. There are mosses in your field guide, so you can go back and look, see what they are. There's lots of moss. Moss is cool. I think it was London who put on her postcard that you can use it to wipe yourself off if you get sweaty on a hike. I thought that was a pretty good one. Anywho, ferns. So that's phylum 2. So ferns actually do have vessels. So they have straws, right? They can drink that water with a straw. So they're going to get bigger. So anything that has vessels is called a vascular plant. Okay. They still reproduce with spores, not seeds. They don't have flowers, and they have that special characteristic leaf shape. You guys have seen that. And if you watch the movie Jurassic Park, they have a whole bunch of these because they're quote ancient plants, right? God might have made these before he made others, but he still created these for a very specific reason. And these are not common ancestors, okay? These are created especially to live in a certain niche in the woods in nice, moist, shady areas, okay? So I gave you some examples of ferns, and we're going to talk about those examples. This one was the first one, or the cinnamon fern on page 90. I did tell you that ferns can be edible. Some people will eat the fiddleheads as they emerge in the spring. They're really cool how they emerge from the ground. So if you Google fiddlehead emerging from the ground time lapse, you might be able to find a cool video of that. Here's an example of little fiddleheads. And then we talked about the fern life cycle. So I'm going to move this over here, okay? Because what I wanted you to understand was something called alternation of generations, okay? So remember, ferns reproduce by spores, not seeds. And there is an article about the differences on your email. They have alternation of generations. So there's male plants and female plants, okay? So we talked about grandpa fern, okay? Grandpa fern is right here, okay? And grandpa fern is diploid, which means that grandpa fern has genetic component from the male and from the female. So you're diploid too, because you have a set of genes from your mom, 23 from mom, 23 from dad, okay? Plants do these weird things with ploidy. They can be diploid, triploid, tetraploid, so polyploidy. We don't do that. If we have 3 copies of every chromosome, we don't get past 8 weeks of life as humans. Some humans will have 3 copies of one chromosome. We call those chromosomally enhanced people. And an example of that would be Down syndrome. And that is a genetic anomaly. But you know what? God doesn't make mistakes. Those people have a lifespan and a role and a purpose in the world. But they do, since they have an extra copy of a chromosome, they have some differences in how their bodies work. So humans are created to only have 2 chromosomes. Plants will have more or less. So ferns do this. So they'll have double the genetic material, so a copy from mom and a copy from dad in the sporophyte phase. So here's grandpa sporophyte. He's got 2N. If N is 1 copy of information, he has double. Okay, don't get too hung up in that. Just know that grandpa fern looks like a fern. Okay, grandpa has babies. Babies' ferns look like blobs, okay? This is called the gametophyte stage of the fern. This has half the amount of genetic information. Now, humans can't live with half the amount of information, but you came from a sperm cell from your father and an egg cell from your mother. So those cells in humans have half the amount of information. So that's a way that reproduction occurs and creates genetic diversity, okay? And God orchestrated all of that. And a lot of his creatures created these diverse genetic blueprints so that we have different traits. DNA is God's clay. It's pretty amazing how he did it. So Grandpa Fern has a baby. Baby looks like a blob. Okay, now the babies have babies. So the grandchildren look like ferns again. Okay, so that's really the point. You got fern, blob, fern, blob, fern, blob. Okay, so it goes over around and around and around. So each generation looks different. So Grandpa's generation looks like a fern. Parents' generation looks like a blob. Grandchildren's generation looks like a fern. Great-grandchildren's generation looks like a blob. Okay? So that's what alternation of generations is. Okay? Ferns do this. Mosses do this. Okay? It's a neat biological phenomena. You will probably never find the gametophyte stage of a fern. They're teeny. Eensy. I mean, this is what, like 100 cells. Okay? Really hard to find. But that's what they do. So there you have it, alternation of generations. So a biological concept that I've thrown in there because I want you to learn a little something so that when you come back to this in biology in high school, you're not overwhelmed. I thought this was so hard when I learned it for the first time. So maybe for you guys, if you've seen it once before, you're like, oh yeah, I've seen that once before. I'm not scared of alternation of generations. It's got nothing on me. All right. So then we talked about some examples of ferns. Okay, so here's my notes again, right? So I stuck my picture. I wrote a picture over here. So sometimes notes will do this. They'll look kind of complicated. But I have the picture of the alternation of generations here. And see, I wrote alternation of generations. It's a moss and fern thing. I wrote that this way. I used my 4-color pen. But then over here, I just have my field guide example. So cinnamon fern, interrupted fern, and sensitive fern are the ones I showed you. Here's the interrupted fern. Remember, it's got these spore-producing portions here in the middle. Okay. And then here's the sensitive fern. All right. It produces the spores right here. Okay. So that's ferns. Now we moved on to gymnosperms. Now we talked about where did that word come from. So that's phylum 3. You can see I still am numbering my pages, class notes, date, continued. Okay. Here's your reminder. Make sure every page has a date. Make sure when you finish your notes this week, you go back to your notebook and update that table of contents. Okay. Phylum 3 is gymnosperms. Still, we've got no flowers. Okay. What does gymno mean? It comes from the word gymnasium. And in Greek times, people went to the gym naked. They didn't have those cool wicking clothes. So naked people. Well, we're not going to talk about that, but I'm going to say, therefore, here's my little triangle, 3 dots, 1, 2, 3. That's a little scientific symbol. It means therefore means naked seats. Okay. So when you do note taking, sometimes you're going to use little symbols. Okay. So gymnosperms means naked seed. So remember, I passed around that pine cone. Here's the pine cone, right? And I passed one that was closed up and one that had been baked in the oven and had opened up and that had the seeds associated with it. And those seeds didn't have any fruit. They were just naked seeds. So the types of gymnosperms that we're going to see in New England are only conifers. Okay, so only conifers are native to New England. But you can grow a ginkgo tree in New England, and one of you won the special prize of science as a ginkgo tree, okay? And you actually can plant that, and it will grow in New England. It's not native. There are male and female ginkgos, and the females make a very smelly fruit. And then also cycad palms. So cycad palms are actually really poisonous to animals, too, because especially like horses and stuff that eat them. Dogs, it would kill them dead. But look at the cycad palm. Isn't it cool? It's really beautiful. But it looks like a pine cone, doesn't it? So same thing. So these are all gymnosperms. These all have naked seeds. There's the ginkgo. There's its really distinct looking leaf and fruit. It's really stinky, but it's actually quite tasty. You can roast those. Here's our eastern white pine and the pine cones. So these are what we're going to see in New England. Thing about plants is that they can grow other places. So the plants I'm going to talk about are going to be the native species. But we still have things like fir trees and spruce trees. And some of those are not necessarily native to New England, but they will still grow. But I'm just going to hit on the main ones. Okay. So we talked about the pine family. So here's looking at the notes again. Okay. So I made a bullet point, conifers, ginkgo, and cycads are the examples of the gymnosperms. But then I used my green pen and I made comments. I circled each one and made a comment, okay, with my colors, okay? And that helps me organize my thoughts, all right? So that's one way to do it. You can also do it, you can make bullet points underneath. So that's some note-taking skills for you. All right. So in the pine family, we have the eastern white pine, the pitch pine, the red pine, the eastern hemlock, and then the American larch, which I circled and made some notes on because remember that was that special one. So here's our pine family. Okay. We talked about those. And then here's the larch tree. We talked about that one. That's a conifer that's deciduous. So when we think about deciduous trees, we think about maples and oaks. They lose their leaves. So Gloria has a puppy. Her puppy has deciduous teeth. So in the next couple of weeks, those teeth, months, are going to come out, those little needle teeth, and he's going to get his big boy teeth. So yes, Cody will not have needles forever. So deciduous means to come out. Or to get lost. All right. So this is the larch tree. It looks like a pine tree, but it loses its needles. Now, all pine trees lose their needles, just not all at once, right? So don't think that pine trees never lose their needles. They do. They're evergreen. So they need to be green all the time because they don't have as much surface area. They live in areas with not as much water in some cases, so they don't lose water as readily. So the way that God made pine trees is that they're able to live in the niche of plants all year round, whereas the deciduous don't. But there's advantages and disadvantages biologically in each. So God's really cool in the way he designs these things to play different roles in the environment. All right, so you're going to find these in your field guide starting on page 100. The larch tree or the tamarack tree is on page 98. My husband grew up on Tamarack Place, so I asked him, hey, did you have tamarack trees? Well, he didn't, but he knew what they were. I did not know what a tamarack tree was until this year. So, hey, I've learned something here as well. Conifers. So moving on to the cypress family. All right. We talked about the Atlantic white cedar and the eastern red cedar. So you see these a lot. These are like all over the place and they can get humongous. It was Adam who said he actually was doing some woodworking and he cut some of these up. So that was it. That was everything with the pines. All right. Let's look at the notes again. So phylum 3, gymnosperms. I talked about what it means. Talked about the different types. Okay. I've sent you this PDF, so you don't have to try to stop the video to copy this. You can actually open the PDF. You can even print it and then copy right from the printout. Okay. If writing's not your thing, you're going to need to learn to make it your thing eventually. Sometimes that's not fun, but that does mean you need to do the copy work, okay? So one of the best ways to learn to take notes, especially if it's a weakness for you, is to force yourself to practice. It's like working out, okay? You want to get ripped, you do P90X, right? It's really hard. It is not fun to do, 800 sit-ups in 20 minutes, but if you do it, you're going to get strong, okay? So writing is the same way. So again, if writing's not your thing, get on it, get strong, copy this stuff down. If writing is your thing and your notes look like this and you've even made them better, that's wonderful. Keep it up. Okay. Phylum 4, angiosperm. So moving on. Okay. So here's the cute little girl. I'm a little partial to this one, right? She is picking blueberries from a high bush blueberry, which is an angiosperm. Okay. It's the most diverse group of land plants. There is endosperm. Now, that's not fruit. Endosperm isn't fruit, okay? Endosperm in the seeds, okay? And those seeds that have the endosperm are also covered with fruit, okay? So it's got two cool things about it. It's the only phylum that has flowers. So here we go. Now, finally, we have flowers, right? Because think of plants, think about flora. Okay, flora, where are the flowers, right? Well, phylum 4, okay? Angiosperm means encased seed, not naked seed. So that's what it means, okay? So we talked about two types or groups of seeds. One was the dicot with 2 cotyledons. The other was the monocot with 1 cotyledon, okay? And I think there's a Brain Pop video on this that I will get for us, and we can watch it at the beginning of class because we're going to continue with our angiosperms in class. So when they sprout, okay, the dicot makes 2 first leaves, the monocot makes 1. So this is grass. Okay, grass is a monocot. Dicot's a bean plant's a dicot, right? It also has a nice taproot. If you've ever picked dandelions, yep, they're dicots. So that's what we talked about, dicots and monocots. And then I showed you this great big picture here that was pretty complicated. But when you break it down, you can see here's the dicot. So di means two, so two cotyledons. So here's the seed coat. Here's the endosperm. The cotyledon is actually this part, okay? And it's the first part of the plant that starts to photosynthesize, and it actually withers down once the plant grows up. So I think it's Priscilla who has the dicot and monocot seed. She's going to grow those in wet paper towels. Just keep those paper towels wet. You might open the paper towels and let some sunlight hit them. Don't let them get moldy. You can even put them in soil if you'd like once they start to root, and keep them moist. But the seed coat breaks open, the cotyledons open up, the leaves start to grow, and there you have. Now you got net-like veins. Remember I showed you the hydrangea plant that I had, and it had these net-like veins. All right. Then I also showed you grass. Grass has these parallel veins. Corn is an example of a monocot. Grass seed. You guys have seen grass seed. It's like one seed. Okay. It looks like that. Okay. So that's monocot. So we talked about dicots and monocots. That was our cool project. So we assigned the cool project. And then we talked about annual plants and perennial plants. Now, here's a great example. I have a terrible time with double letters, okay? So I spelled perennial with 2 R's instead of 2 N's, okay? So if you make a mistake and you're writing in pen and it's a science notebook, don't block it out. Just put one line through it, okay? That's the way you do a correction. Don't, he's like, do you have whiteout? I asked one of my kids that. They're like, who has whiteout these days? Well, nobody, because usually we type. But I do want you to learn how to write notes, because writing is the first step of getting it in your head. And then eventually you might even type notes. When you take class, you might be sitting on a computer, and you might have a second device like an iPad, and you might be taking notes in Evernote or something like that on your classes. So you might be typing notes someday. Knowing how to organize your thoughts on paper first will help you do that well. Okay, so here's an example of an annual. It doesn't come back, so this milkweed plant's just going to die. All right, and I passed out those milkweed seeds, so that'll make more seeds, right? Remember, I brought the milkweed pod in, passed that around, and we saw that. Here's an example of a perennial. This is one of my favorites here, Echinacea. This grows in New England beautifully. This is the spotted frillatary butterfly that we're actually taking a picture of, and it attracts butterflies and hummingbirds and all kinds of wonderful things. But this flower will die in the winter, in the fall, winter, but the roots will stay alive, and it will grow. It'll come back. It'll regrow, whereas the milkweed won't. Okay, apple trees, they're going to produce their fruit. That fruit is covered, is flesh-covered seeds. So the seeds are in there. Those seeds actually do have an endosperm and a seed coat, and an animal will eat the apple. It'll go through the animal, and the animal will defecate in a field, and there will be a new apple tree, or we will plant them, or Johnny Appleseed will come. But basically, once that gets started, that plant stays alive and regrows every year. And finally, I left you with the idea of a shrub versus a tree versus a plant. Okay, so plants have thick stems. They don't necessarily have woody stems. Shrubs have woody stems, but not trunks. Trees have trunks. And we're going to get into the trees next. There's our dog forlornly pondering the coniferous deciduous forest here. So you can see there's a tree, and that might be a conifer. I think, in fact, it is. And here's another tree, and that might be a maple tree. So in our area, we have evergreens and deciduous angiosperms in the same forest. So that was it. That was the end of our class notes. So you guys are going to work on your plant collection, okay? Not this week, next week. So 10 to 20, but I'd say let's keep it at like 10 is plenty, okay? These are the glass flowers at the Harvard Museum of History. You can get into the Harvard Museum of History on Sunday, and you can park down there very easily if you go before 12 noon. So if you can like boogie there right after an early church service, you can get in for free as a Massachusetts resident. If you're not a Massachusetts resident, you can secure a library pass. This is a very old-timey, really cool museum. There are specimens that are dead and stuffed. All the mammals, really great. I definitely recommend you go and see it. There's a mammal as we're speaking, but the glass flowers are really cool. Okay. So we had our fun prize drawing, some neat prizes. So I think it was, Oh, Lydia won the root and grow. So Lydia, if you will root some plants and grow them and bring them in for us to see, I will be contacting a few of you to come man the table of science on plants on Friday. So we'll be doing that together and showing off our leaf chromatography experiment. Okay. So until we meet again, have a good week. Remember to read through the very long email that I have. Try to just take it a bit at a time. The bonus material will appear for the next 2 weeks. So don't worry if you don't get to it this week. You have a couple of weeks. And it's not required. I'm throwing it out there because some of you guys are chomping at the bit for more. Okay? Have a great Monday, and we will see you later.